to the Shop, episode 222, How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race and Justice with Kwame Christian. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFurio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for being here today for this very, very important conversation about race and justice with past guest on the show and the founder of American Negotiation Institute, Kwame Christian. Really good things we're discussing today, so stick around for that. Now, I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet subscribed to the show, to just hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. You'll always be up to date with new episodes. And also, if you would leave a rating or review for the show on iTunes, that would be really awesome too. That really helps the show gain visibility, get these ideas out there as well. And finally, Keys to the Shop has a community of like-minded coffee professionals in the Mighty Networks platform. It is the Keys to the Shop Mighty Network community, and I really want you to be a part of it. We're all there trying to help each other get better at what we do in the coffee shop. So asking questions, coming up with solutions for each other, sharing resources. This is what the vision is for this group, and it is a growing group, so we would love to have your contribution, your input in there. So just go to the link provided in the show notes to become a part of that community, and it's as easy as that. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Prima Coffee is an amazing specialty coffee equipment supplier. They're based right here in Louisville, Kentucky, where I am based as well. I've known them since the beginning of their company. Love what they do because they curate the best equipment from all over the world and then match it perfectly with your needs. If you're expanding, if you're opening your first store, if you need to upgrade your equipment, this is the company to partner with. Over at prima-coffee.com. They're all about helping equip you with the tools you need for making great coffee. It's what drives them. So if you go to prima-coffee.com, you'll see the amazing selection, but also know that they have great resources to help you learn how to use that equipment, how to maintain that equipment. And they're just very generous with that information because they are all about helping facilitate your success in coffee. So I would encourage you, whether it's espresso machines, brewers, grinders, or even under-counter refrigeration that you need, reach out to Prima Coffee over at prima-coffee.com. Fantastic people, amazing service, prima-coffee.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Barista Series from Pacific. This is the world's leading line of plant-based performance beverages that are designed specifically for the professional barista and is highly influenced by the feedback of professional baristas too. So whatever you use from their lineup in the Barista Series, you know that it's going to perform on the bar the way that you always hoped a plant-based beverage would. And that means it takes the heat from steaming, it produces an amazing texture that's perfect for latte art in every drink, and it keeps the flavor balance of your beverage focused on the coffee. So obviously these things are really important for your customers. And honestly, if you want the best in the business for your plant-based offerings in your cafe, then you need look no further than the Barista Series from Pacific. Find out more over at pacificfoods.com. You can just go to the show notes and find a link there. It takes you right to the food service section. Just get these in your store and try them for yourself. You'll see why the Barista Series is such a go-to for those who want to serve their customers the best. Again, visit pacificfoods.com. Okay, everybody. So today we are going to be diving into a difficult conversation about race and justice, and specifically how to have that conversation, because that is what we really do need to do as coffee shops, as people who are leaders of staff, and also people who serve our communities. It is something that people are looking for us to weigh in on as public institutions. We serve the public. And when conversations like this are happening in the community and in society, we need to create space to have conversations with our community and with our staff about these things, especially if we haven't done that before. It could be argued that we've always needed to do this. And today, to help guide us into the right way to have these conversations about race and justice in these relationships that we have, is my good friend Kwame Christian. Kwame is the director of the American Negotiation Institute and is a subject matter expert on the field of negotiation and conflict resolution. He's also a best-selling author and speaker and conducts workshops all around North America and abroad. He is the host also of the Negotiate Anything podcast, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. He is dedicated to empowering others through the art and science of negotiation. He authored the book Finding Confidence in Conflict, which helps people overcome their fear and anxiety and emotions around difficult conversations through a framework called compassionate curiosity. We can use a ton of that today. He is also a past guest on the show. If you remember, back in 2018 on episode 125, we talked about confidence in conflict and went over some of that framework as well. And we're going to dive into that today too. It's very, very helpful, this conversation. I think he lays out a great plan for us to approach this important topic. And I think to use the word important is a bit of an understatement. I'd say critical, essential, foundational. It's something that we do need to be prepared for. In this conversation with Kwame, he does such an amazing job helping us in this. We get to talk about the relationship you have with your staff and how to approach individuals that are needing to have conversations with you about this topic, and as well as how your company interacts with your community and what's going on out there in the world. So my hope for this episode is that it's challenging for you, is that it's equipping, that it is something that helps you dive into self-awareness and learning about the needs of those around you and the perspective of those around you. And it creates a path forward for a better future for all people in the relationship between the coffee shop and the people that rely on it. This is a critical moment where we need to step up and into these conversations and into these relationships. So again, Kwame does a great job helping us take the right first step. So without further ado from me, here now is my conversation with Kwame Christian on how to have difficult conversations about race and justice. Well, Kwame, really good to have you back on the show, man. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, this is a conversation, about conversations. And it's very of the moment. It's a super critical one, and one that I think is very familiar to you, because this used to be something that you did as a living before you started the American Negotiation Institute, and you recently held a webinar. It was very well attended, a free webinar. I think it was on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah, I streamed it live and had it on Zoom too.
Yeah, and it was just how to have difficult conversations about race and justice, and something we need to hear. So I wonder if we could start just by learning a little bit about your life before American Negotiation Institute and what led to putting on that webinar.
Yeah, so before starting the American Negotiation Institute, I straight out of law school, I was part of an organization called the Kirwan Institute. And so I did civil rights work. My focus was on health equity and criminal justice. And so with health equity, I was talking about the disparate outcomes between minorities and the majority population, and how that tied into race and poverty, socioeconomic status, those type of things. Talked about implicit bias, did implicit bias trainings for lawyers and police officers. And it was very hard work and very emotionally draining work, having to expose yourself constantly to some of the most difficult and challenging parts of American society day in, day out, without really seeing much of a payoff is tough to sustain. And so I burnt out and eventually started my own practice doing business law. Just really wanted to start my own business and then also work with other people who were starting businesses, and then transitioned into the American Negotiation Institute. That was always my goal, to do negotiation consulting. I wanted to rack up a few years of legal practice first for credibility, and here we are.
How have you been able to see the difference in what you're doing now and how it addresses some of the same things?
Yeah, I think for me, it's two main things. So the first thing is I'm very achievement oriented. So I live off of wins. I like getting momentum. And I tell people, it sounds pathological, but trust me, it's fine. It's I feel like these little mini victories, whatever it might be at work or at home, those are like oxygen. It's great in the moment, but I don't think of much about my last breath. I need the next one, right? And when I was working at Kerwin, I just felt like I wasn't accumulating those wins. Racism was not going away. These structural inequalities are not going away. And so it just felt as though I wasn't getting those wins. And then the next one, like I said, just constantly being exposed to these difficult parts of society was tough. And even going back into my childhood, I remember how difficult it was for me to see even my mom reading books to me, and the protagonist was struggling and the evil person was winning. I would ask my mom to fast forward to the end so I could see the resolution. Yeah. And so it was just it was really tough for me to spend so much time doing that, and that's what led me to the transition.
Mm-hmm. So in talking before our conversation here today, you mentioned being able to create those wins in a sense with how you facilitate training for people who are still, on the front lines of that civil rights effort and those racial justice fights. And so it seems as though the work you do and what I know of your work, that's been something really fruitful.
Yeah, it's been fun being able to mix in that type of work with the corporate clients and that I usually do. And so I still work with my colleagues who are doing health equity work. And what I do there is I focus specifically on how they can take their policy arguments and make them more persuasive, because they often have facts, they have data, they have research and all those things. And if you think about it from their perspective, they might have gone through, got their master's of public policy, master's in health policy, or PhD or whatever. And in those programs, they're taught to do research, figure out what the right answer is, and then provide that right answer to somebody else. And then they say, oh, you have the right answer. Let me change my ways. But that's just not how persuasion works. And that's where frustration comes for them. And so for me, I can come in and say, let me bridge this gap between where you are and where you want to be when it comes to persuasion. And then I can actually see that win. After the training, I can see clearly, okay, you get it. Now you have new skills to have these conversations. So I'm not on the front lines myself, but I'm equipping the people on the front lines with the skills they need to be more persuasive.
Excellent. And we are all collecting information about, what's going on in the world. And right now with, the racial justice that we're desiring to see in the world, we're collecting information. We're via news, via our own hometowns, especially, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, and this is one of the flashpoints for the struggle here. When you have all that information, it's hard to know what to do with it, especially if you are wanting to have a substantive conversation with somebody. And again, like you said, be persuasive and help where you can, right? And so if you're training people who have already got their masters in all this information and they still need to learn these skills, it seems like it would be very much true for us as well, who aren't as highly educated with the same types of information.
Well, I would say this. I think when you come out of school, I think everybody receives the same level of education as it relates to how to be persuasive, which is nothing. Think about it. So if you go through school, we're learning how to do these complex calculations. I can't remember the last time I had to do algebra or calculus, but I remember it ruining my life when I was in high school and college. Why am I doing that? I don't know. Somebody said I could. But I can remember several times in maybe the past 24 hours where I've had difficult conversations, where I've had to persuade somebody, change somebody's mind, but we don't equip people with those skills. We make people feel as though all you need to do is go through this process to find what the right answer is, and then you provide it to somebody else, and then they get it and they change their mind. But it's not that easy. And so I think it's not that big of a disconnect between people in different industries, because very few people are equipped with the skills to have the difficult conversations.
Just to balance things out, as we're talking about persuasion, we're using that word, I think it's not just about changing somebody's mind necessarily, but it is also about empathy and understanding in the conversation. In our last conversation on the show, that was pretty much apparent. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, and so let's break down empathy. So when we talk about empathy, we're talking about trying to get a better understanding of how the person sees, thinks, and feels about the situation. That's all it is. And it doesn't mean that we agree with what they're saying or what they're feeling or thinking, but we understand it. And we're not going to be able to persuade anybody if we don't have empathy. It's a requisite part of the process. If you're persuading without empathy, that means you're forcing somebody. That's closer to coercion or manipulation. And we don't like that. Even if it's a situation where you're able to successfully get them to do something differently, they're going to hold it against you and they're not going to be very committed because they know that they didn't have a sense of ownership over the process or the outcome. And so that's why it's so important to take the time to empathize and listen and understand, because you need to not only understand where people are currently in order to move them to where you ultimately want them to go, but you also need to let them know that you see them, that you hear them, that you understand them. And when you demonstrate that, now they're going to be more willing to make any adjustments.
That makes a lot of sense. And because, especially with a topic like this, you want to see long-term change. And we talk about this with topics like sustainability within an industry, that the buy-in needs to be there at a certain point. When you're dealing with a company, for example, it's easy enough for a company to put out a post about what's going on in the world. It's very, very easy to do. But making change looks like making it a core of your business and, a lens by which you view a lot of things through. And that takes a lot of conversations. That takes a lot of time to be able to meet at a table and change what has been previously just a lot of momentum and a lot of structure. And it does take time to create that structural change.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big things that we need to recognize as part of the process is commitment, getting people to commit to what it is that they say they're going to do. Because if you look at what's happening now with the killing of George Floyd and how that's sparked a national and frankly international debate about justice, race in society, those type of things, a lot of times these conversations are just filled with a lot of passion, a lot of energy, and that's good. That's to be expected. But the thing is, if you persuade people just based on passion and energy and emotion in general alone, that's problematic because emotions fade. Mm-hmm. Emotions fade with time. And if you just build it on that foundation, then the commitment will fade with time as well. And so when you're having these conversations, you really need to be mindful about what you can do to make sure that they stick.
One of the places that a lot of these conversations happen is in that third place, as we call places of gathering that are not home or work. Coffee shops, we like that phrase. It's sociologically speaking who we are, and actually lots of revolutions have, had their headquarters in coffee shops. And so the society that you serve, the community, they're talking about this stuff in your shop, in your baristas, your staff. They're part of that community, even though they're your employees. No matter how strong your culture is in your store, it's not as strong as the culture that they're involved with outside the store. And so it behooves us, and this is why we're having this conversation today, to be able to approach these conversations not just for brand image, or out of a sense of self-preservation, but just out of a desire to serve our community and the people that we employ and we interact with as businesses. And so I wonder if we could just dive into this with a pretty open question, I guess, is what would you say is the first step for somebody, let's say a coffee shop owner who has baristas on their staff, they're involved in the community, they see all of this happening, and they want to address it properly. What's the first step to diving into that in a way that's helpful and substantive?
Well, think about it in terms of persuasion, just like we described earlier. So we have to think about it in terms of understanding the person who is our audience. And so who's our audience here? It's going to be our employees. Those are going to be those people are going to be part of our audience. It's going to be our patrons. Those people are going to be part of our audience as well. It's going to be the community at large who operates around you that might not be they might not be customers per se, but they are aware of you, right? These are the people who are going to be in your audience. And so we have to think about perceptions from their end, perceptions of action versus inaction. Because I'm going to be honest, I'm one of those people who wanted to kind of sit on the sidelines because this is a very difficult conversation for me to have. I'd rather not. But you also have to consider not just how you feel about it, but how they feel about it, they being your audience in general. And so inaction is going to be perceived as something very negative. And the example that I give is, imagine I have a wife and a kid. So imagine I come home one day and Whitney and Kai are just sitting on the floor of the kitchen, just in tears, just bawling, crying, just inconsolable. And I go and I say, man, I've had a really hard day. Just a really, really hard day. I do not want to deal with this. I don't even know what to say. I don't know what happened. I don't even know what to say. I didn't do anything wrong. And then I just sit on the couch and don't say anything and just wait for the emotional situation that they're in to pass over. How do they feel about that? At best, it's indifferent. Kwame just doesn't care about us. At worst, you're going to seem complicit, as in, I was in emotional distress. You could have done something, you didn't, and that means you're operating on behalf of the thing that has caused this distress to me. And so we have to think about it from that perspective too. And when we think about it that way, then we say, oh, wow, it's more than just an obligation. It's something that I really need to do because I cannot allow people to think that about me. Whether or not it's true is a completely different story, but perception is reality. And we can't have that perception looming over your business because it'll have significant consequences.
Right. Oh, and to say nothing of the fact that, you'd be hard pressed. There are owners out there, and I don't want to think that there are owners in the audience of Keys to the Shop that are indifferent and callous to their employees. I have, been an employee of folks like that, but giving the benefit of the doubt that you want to care for your people, which is a central theme to our whole show here, that it's not just about your business, which you do have to make sure that you're caring for, but it is about your people. Like, you love your wife and kid. I love my wife and kid. As you're saying that, I'm thinking, I couldn't even imagine doing something, but in this moment, it is very similar, and people have had similar reactions to businesses that don't do enough for COVID. And now it's another way. So if you learned your lesson in COVID, you can apply maybe the same lesson here, which is you have no choice to respond. Even you didn't want it to happen necessarily, but it's something that you need to respond to, and maybe it's a blessing in disguise because you'll learn something in the process.
Absolutely. And the thing is, a lot of times when it comes to negotiation and difficult conversations, I tell people this all the time. They might want to avoid conflict, but sometimes the situation is you didn't choose war, but war chose you. And if war chooses you and you don't fight, you're going to lose the war, the war that you didn't want to happen. And so we have to do something. And then the question becomes, well, then what is that thing? And that leads us to the difficult conversation. I think internally we have to have difficult conversations about race. What does it mean? How do we respond? Those type of things. How do I create an inclusive atmosphere? And how do I involve people in the conversation and create an environment of what they call psychological safety, where people feel as though they can share without reprisal, without people coming back and saying, okay, you're fired. for right. Sharing, right? Yeah. And so if we do that and we're open to those truths, then we're going to adjust, and we can start to create that company culture that we want. But it starts with a difficult conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea that it's now a war that you didn't want but you're in is also to say, I think that it's something that always existed before, but now you're forced to become aware of it, right?
Exactly.
And so, and it may be something that people were wondering about before. For a lot of people that maybe in their companies have issues with diversity, they have issues with, their community involvement. This is maybe a good opportunity to rectify some of those things in the long term. So it's not just about having the conversation so that you can, care for your staff, but also maybe, like I said, learn something yourself that will change the way you do business into the future. So when we're looking at having those difficult conversations, let's start by saying how do we enter into that, practically speaking, in a way that's going to set up that psychological safety and engage in empathy to the other person, so that we're not just coming in there as somebody trying to check something off a list.
Yeah, I think candor, honesty, vulnerability, those are things where we need to start. And so people say oftentimes, I don't know what to say. Say that. Just say, listen, this is really hard for me, and I cannot fathom how some of you are feeling just because of my lived experience. And so honestly, I don't know what to say other than I'm here for you and I support you and I'm here to listen. And then ask a question, what can I do to be supportive? And then just begin the conversation there. And I think if you it's not articulate, you don't need to be Hemingway or anything like that, but you just need to say something. And I think acknowledging the awkwardness, the embedded awkwardness in these conversations is a fair place to start. People would respect that.
People are afraid of leaning into something like that because they feel as though they're going to be punished for saying the wrong thing. How do you get over that hump?
Yeah, I would say this too. I would say, listen, I want to be as supportive as possible. I want to be as involved in this as possible. And one of my fears is that I might say the wrong thing and be punished for that. And so in order for me to be engaged and be the supportive leader you need me to be right now, I need you to help me to do that the right way. And if I say or do something that's offensive, call me out on it so I can make those adjustments. Because when you approach it that way, again, you're being so open to them. When you do make those missteps, they say, hey, Chris told me he was probably going to make a misstep in his attempt to help out. This is one of those times. And when he said that, I said that I would help him. Hey, Chris, hey, FYI, we don't use that term. It kind of comes off the wrong way. Well, thank you. I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And so again, you're creating that scenario where there's psychological safety, not just for your employees, for them to share, but for yourself. And so you're covering yourself with a little bit of grace because they can see your heart. So they're no longer questioning your intent.
Yeah, I like that. And I am all for the idea of, having that culture built up of feedback. We've got an episode about building a feedback culture. I'm not sure what episode that was, but the point is that, opening yourself up to be able to be somebody who's learning, and nobody really wants a boss who's this robot, not human, constantly being perfect. That's the old way of doing management and business, management through fear and intimidation. But then there's also something to be said for, how do you make it something that you take the burden of without making a burden for your employees? So in other words, there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into being a barista already and serving the public, especially when the public has to, let it out about COVID and now let it out about what's going on in the world. So they might already be in a state of burnout. So as you're approaching them as a leader, what's the balance between, hey, I'm going to own this and work and do the work, versus having people hold you accountable and therefore making them work?
Yeah, great question. And I'll answer with something that I should have answered with, I should have brought up before, which is the framework that we're going to use for all of these conversations, which is the compassionate curiosity framework. Mm-hmm. And so that's from my book, Finding Confidence in Conflict. And it's a really simple framework that you can use in any difficult conversation at work or at home. And step 1 is acknowledge the emotions. Step 2 is get curious with compassion. And step 3 is joint problem solving. And so if the person is feeling burnt out and exhausted already, acknowledge that. Hey, listen, I know your job is tough as it is, and this is just adding another layer of emotional burden for you. So I can see that, and it makes sense that you might feel burnt out. And considering what's happening and considering how you're feeling, what do you think our approach should be in order to respond effectively while still allowing you to have the mental space you need to perform. And so with that, you seamlessly transition from acknowledging how the person is feeling to an open-ended question. And that's how you begin the dialogue. And if you stick to this framework, any conversation at work or at home, it will go a lot better.
Well, in previous conversations with you, you're somebody who doesn't necessarily go for a win-win in a negotiation. In this conversation, it seems like every conversation is a negotiation in that you're trying to gain understanding one way and the other way. So assuming that you're not going to have like a perfect setup in the conversation, like how do you frame it? So you're saying, okay, it's not a win-win, but what is it?
Yeah, and I think when we think about things in terms of win-win or the different titles we might give it, it limits the approach that we have. And the way that I think about it more is in terms of future-focused problem solving. There's a problem, we're trying to solve it, and we need to focus on what the future looks like for both of us, more so than the past. Because if we focus on the past, that's where there are a lot of emotions. You did this, no, I did that, those type of things. And memory is very flawed at times. So I encourage people to always look into the future for those answers to those questions. That's the first thing. And then with this, it's a more collaborative process because this isn't one of those antagonistic relationships where there's competition built in. So for instance, with a supplier where we're negotiating where more for me means less for you in a lot of instances. Here we are actually on the same team. And so having a more collaborative approach is a much better way to go. And that also, considering how touchy the subject is, I think that approach is going to really bear fruit because the goal is not only to find a resolution, but at the same time, preserve and potentially strengthen the relationship in the process.
Yeah, I love that outcome, to strengthen a relationship. And honestly, some of the strongest relationships that I've ever had are ones that have had a lot of conflict it's amazing what happens, and it happens over time. So what do we do when we're having these conversations as leaders? Especially, the comments can be made that we feel that the way that you've conducted business has been in a detriment to the thing that we value. And so there's a reconciliation aspect of a lot of these conversations when people feel like othered, or people feel that their previous attempts to try to communicate something have been unheard. How do you approach these conversations when people start sharing difficult things with you? That really holds your feet to the fire for, I know we want to be future focused, but it's addressing things from the past that they want to address so that we can move forward. I mean, how do we react to that in the moment?
Oh, this is great. So on my show, the Negatiate Anything podcast, we have what's called Sparring Sessions, where we try to role play a scenario. So I think this is actually a good opportunity for that. Mm-hmm. So let's say if you're that person and you're bringing up something to me, I'll do what the manager should do using the framework. So let's say there's something in the past I wasn't listening, those type of things, and here I am trying in this conversation. So what could that look like? And I'll play the role of the manager.
Well, one of the things that is on my mind that I've really been struggling with is that over the past year or so, I've really felt like my voice has not been heard, or that you have listened to other people in the company a lot more than me and given them more of an opportunity to influence the way things are. I am already a minority in the company, and it makes me feel as though you have a bit of a bias toward the people in my company who look like you, frankly, who are just, white men. And if I'm not one of them and I don't belong here, then I don't want to continue working here unless I know that I'm valued equally.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Chris, I apologize for what I've done in the past. And at the same time, I want to thank you for saying what you said, because I know that's not easy. So first, I want to commend you for sharing that with me, and I genuinely appreciate it, because I can't get better unless you let me know. So first, thank you for that. And just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, it sounds like in the past, based on decisions that I've made, you haven't felt valued and also I haven't done a good job of listening to you. And at the same time, I've done a better job of listening to other people, and I've given other people opportunities. And it's created this scenario where you feel as though there's potentially a bias that's leading to that behavior. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's the way that that's what I've been experiencing. Yes.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it sounds like I haven't really done a good job of demonstrating how much I appreciate your work, and I haven't been giving you those opportunities that you want. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think especially considering that I put in the same amount of work and in some cases more than others in the company, it's just kind of I don't know how else to interpret what's going on other than just some form of racism or favoritism. But that's where my mind is at right now.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And considering your experience, that interpretation of what's happening, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I apologize. And now here's the thing, Chris, I value you as an employee, and I want you to stay on the team, and I want you to contribute, and I want to see you move up in this organization. And so what can I do better as a manager to keep you here and keep you engaged?
Well, I think for one thing, we're growing, and I want to be a part of the conversation the way that I had been wanting to be a part of it. And so I think just a substantial seat at the table, and some kind of a form of dedication from you to increase the diversity of this workforce as well, because I do think that is going to be a problem for me, and it's something that I do feel needs to be addressed.
Right. Okay. And to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, it's two main things. Number one, you want to have a voice. You want to have a seat at the table when these big decisions are being made. And number two, you want to make sure that we are continuing to grow the diversity and inclusion that we have here in the company. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. I think we should have been doing that all along.
No, I think you're right. And here's the thing. Like I said, you're a valued member of this organization and this community, and your voice needs to be heard in this. And I need your help in order to do that. And so, considering the fact that we want to have more diversity and we want to give you those kinds of opportunities going forward, what types of tangible things can we do to make that happen?
Right. And I just want to mention one thing here, that you say that I'm a valued member. Again, that's something that I'm taking issue with. And so I think maybe, to say that, I don't want you to think as though, you can keep doing what you've been doing, because my experience of what a valued member of the team has been doesn't feel valuable. And I just want to mention that. But going forward, I think just being able to have the conversation with, and be part of that team in a substantive way, and know that you're working towards that, and in making it a reality in the way the business is run, and not just with words.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, thank you for sharing that. And that makes me realize that I need to do a better job of not just saying that you're valuable, but proving to you that you're valuable. And so how about we do this? Let me go back and think about what it is that I can do better. Let's schedule a meeting for next week. I want you to think about things that we can do, that I can do personally, and we can do as an organization, tangible things. And let's figure out what we can do to create a better company culture.
I do think that that's, I don't know that I want to take on the burden of having to do something I feel is your responsibility, or the responsibility of the leadership. And so, I don't know, how to necessarily take that. I'm just coming to you with something that I've been experiencing. I feel like I do good work, and that should be my work here is what I'm paid for. And that should be work enough.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. And let me explain too. My goal with that is to try to give you what it is that you want, which is a seat at the table. And if that level of involvement isn't what you're looking for, then don't feel obligated to do that. I just want to make sure that I'm doing things to make sure that you can have that voice and be heard and feel like you're a valued member of the team, while at the same time increasing the inclusivity level. So I think what I need to do here is think about how I can make you feel valuable, number one, increase diversity, number two, while at the same time not putting more on your plate, because you're right, this isn't your responsibility as well. But what I would ask is that if you see me making a misstep, let me know so I can make adjustments sooner rather than later. Because like I said, I want your voice to be heard and I want you to feel valued too. What did you think about that?
Well, I think, historically on the show, when there's a role play, I'm never very well prepared. But I think that what I tried to do is channel what I hear a lot of, happening in coffee bars. And obviously I'm not doing it perfectly, and it's from what I've listened to and heard. And so forgive me, anyone out there who's saying that's not what I would have said, because that it's just an imperfect representation. And I try to give you a good deal of pushback, like an employee would, especially in an emotional place where we all are right now. I think it was good to apologize right from the beginning, instead of get defensive. That's, I feel like, a huge win for any leader to do. And then I started to get concerned when I think we were talking about me doing the work, and I'm going to be included, but I'm going to be included about being included. When the whole thing was about being included in business. So I'm just not somebody who's, and this is just one position of tension, where it's a racial tension, when there might be other tensions of sexual orientation, gender, or religious, or whatever it is. Yeah, but I think that it was a fair back and forth, and no conversation. Like we said in the beginning, no conversation is perfect, though. So what kind of things were you trying to establish, and what would you want us to learn from this conversation that you think would help in this situation?
Yeah, the first thing is, again, sticking to the framework. Acknowledge and validate emotions. Number two, get curious with compassion. And step three, joint problem solving. So whenever you see emotions, you acknowledge the emotions using "it sounds like," or what I'm hearing is, those type of things. And "it sounds like," or "it seems like," those are the keywords. And so then you name the emotion. It sounds like you're not feeling valued. It sounds like you're feeling frustrated, those type of things. And so it's a flexible framework, because I acknowledge that and validated it, which is validation says, it makes sense. That's it. I'm not saying I agree with you. I'm just saying it makes sense. Given your perspective, the way you're feeling makes sense. And that's it, in order to make somebody feel validated. And then you get curious with compassion. You start asking those open-ended questions, getting more information, seeing what type of things could work. And then you transition to joint problem solving. You're inviting them into the process to try to figure out the solution. And that's where it started to get a little bit messy, not messy in a bad way, but just messy in a human way, where I say, okay, could we do this? And you say, no, I don't want to do that because that makes me feel blah. And then we say, acknowledge emotion. I noticed that emotion. I'm going to acknowledge that. Yeah, I recognize that you're already feeling a bit overwhelmed, and doing this would add more to your plate. So that makes sense. Now we go back to the joint problem solving. This is just a brainstorming session where we're just going back and forth. Once you overcome that barrier of the emotion, and we overcome that barrier of the lack of information, now we're just trading proposals and trying to figure out what works.
I want to ask this question, because I love the framework, and there's two things rolling around in my head. One is how the emotion of the moment, in its intensity, isn't something that's going to be every day. So where somebody in that position might say, okay, I don't want to be the one to do the work here, they might, in another situation or in another context, be more desirous to be involved in a solution, while in the moment they don't feel that way. And so it would be tempting to try to force them into that position saying, well, isn't this what you want to make a difference? And it's something I feel I hear a lot, bosses doing that. It's a not a good form of delegation, I don't think.
No, and here's the thing too. We don't need to complete these conversations right now. I like talking about the term micro negotiations. Sometimes we reach a point in a negotiation where we've accomplished all that we can accomplish. Maybe the emotion is too great. Maybe there are too many issues to deal with. And so what we do is we just stay firm to the process, acknowledge emotions, get curious with compassion. Maybe we don't get to the point where we transition into joint problem solving, but we accept what we've gotten in this moment. And then we say, listen, I think we've made a lot of progress, which is fantastic. Let's schedule another conversation to finish this up and see what we do moving forward. And I think that's beneficial too. And then another thing to do is clearly define the problem, because sometimes people are expressing a problem that they're looking for a solution. Sometimes people are expressing a problem just to let you know how they feel, and they're not even looking for you to do anything.
Right.
And so sometimes that's all we need to do. And if we try to force a solution, then we're going to get frustrated and they're going to get frustrated. We're going to be frustrated because we haven't reached a resolution. So this conversation is a failure. It's incomplete. And for them, they're going to say, all I need for you is to just hear me and tell me what I'm saying makes sense. Ask me some questions to understand my experience, empathize, that's it. You do that, you win. And then you're trying to force these solutions on me. I'm not ready or willing to commit to anything right now. I'm just venting. And I think at the beginning, if you try to figure out what it is that the person wants, and you can do this during the getting curious with compassion part of the process, asking things like, what is your goal today? Or what would be a win for you? Those type of things to figure out what type of resolution they're looking for. It'll become a lot clearer which direction you need to go in the conversation.
That makes sense, because we have that same kind of approach to customers. Some customers want to hear a lot about the coffee. Other people just want a cup of coffee. And they don't want to be a part of that conversation necessarily. And so we're trying to preemptively understand, from body language and from, from their words, like, is this a conversation where, like you said, do we need to find a resolution here? Or do they even want to be, like, I think the third way might just be that they want to vent. They want to let you know in a way that is saying you should have known, and then they don't want to be a part of building something that they feel is up to you to build. So they do want a solution. They just don't want to be on the Slack channel, a conversation involved, like getting pinged all day, because that's pretty taxing.
Exactly. Yep. And again, it comes down to our ability to clearly define the problem. Mm-hmm. The clearer we are, the clearer the solution is going to be. And sometimes it's not always something tangible.
Curiosity is such a powerful thing. And it's curiosity in this sense. We've been talking about the curiosity toward the other person that we're talking to get a sense for where they're coming from. But I wonder how it is also reversed in a way that, how can we open ourselves up in this conversation to being curious about where we're coming from that needs to change?
Yeah. And I think what we need to do is do some homework, because the cool thing about the compassionate curiosity framework is that it can be used internally and externally, because we've been focusing on how to have the conversation externally, how I can handle that difficult conversation. But a lot of times we don't handle that internal negotiation. What does that look like? And so we need to become self-aware. That's the first step. Acknowledge how we feel about the situation and accept that. And then we have to move on to getting curious with compassion. How do I feel about this situation? Why do I feel that way? What led me to this conclusion? And then we get to the part where it's joint problem solving. And in this part of the process, we're reconciling the differences between our hearts and minds. How do I feel about the process? But then when I actually think about the situation in a logical way, what is really happening? Sometimes we might need to bring in an objective third party to help us see what's actually happening. And then once we get that clarity, we can reconcile those differences and come up with a solution that not only satisfies our emotional needs, but also substantively, it creates a solution that works for both parties.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge, because here I'm just going to use Louisville as an example. if you work in a coffee bar, chances are very high that you're a straight white man that is also studying at the seminary. We have a huge seminary here, and that's just a joke and also a reality a lot of times. And so how do you have a coffee shop in a neighborhood where it's just hugely diverse, but then everybody is, of this particular, group. And so that third party sometimes is so helpful because, you don't recognize, like, the fish doesn't know it's wet, and sometimes you just need to be shook right out of it.
Right. You're spot on. And again, self-awareness. If you're trying to get somewhere, the first place you need to know is where you currently are on the map, right? You can't navigate anywhere if you don't know where you currently are. And so that's what this process is all about. It's about emotional intelligence. And this gives you an actual process to figure that out.
Would you say that that is probably the first thing that we should do before setting up a meeting with somebody?
Yeah, we need to figure out what we think and feel about the situation, because a lot of times what ends up happening is people get into these conversations and they're just emoting. I am just sharing how I feel. The other person's trying to figure out, so what do I do next? What should I, what do you want to accomplish? Those type of things. And we're not even there yet. We're just saying, no, but this is how I feel. Okay, I get that. What's next? And so for us, the clearer we are with ourselves, the clearer we can be with other people.
Yeah. Wow. So the other thing that I was kind of thinking about was that very thing was the idea that we start with ourselves. And then in this conversation that you and I had, this fictional, imperfect conversation, it seems as though a lot of what I perceived as the staff member as missteps, and maybe even so far as to say inappropriate suggestions that for solutions that you made, were something that if you had sat with the problem, you might have said, well, I'm not going to come up with that for them. Because, you know what I mean? Like, you can pre-game a little bit, right? Like, what role does that play?
Oh, that's the biggest role. I mean, that's one of the biggest things you can do to be successful. So if you go to our website, AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com/guide, you can get access to all of our negotiation preparation guides, where you do a step-by-step walkthrough on what to do, what you can say, what options are available, those type of things, so you can actually be less surprised during the conversation. You want to pre-think as much as the conversation as possible, not be scripted, but be prepared. So you're not caught off guard. And so in study after study, they show that the people who are the most successful in negotiations are the ones who are the most prepared. And it's one of the most simple things that we can do. And so we have one for salary negotiation, one for just general business negotiation, one for how to have difficult conversations about race, all of that easy access for free on the American Negotiation Institute's website.
Nice. Thanks for that. How would you suggest to the coffee shop owners out there to put their best foot forward as a company, because there's the manager, there's the owner sitting down face to face with an employee, and that's an individual relationship. But then there's this corporate relationship that you've got with your community and your branding and all of that, and how you have that conversation there. To me, it seems like is that it's got to be somewhat different. But how do we engage that way using a similar approach?
Yeah, and so when it comes to the compassionate curiosity framework, it's best when utilized interpersonally. This is an interpersonal conversation over the phone, video conference, or in person. Now, the rules are a little bit different when it comes to online communication. Similar but different, and that's more on the marketing side. Because when it comes to online communication, you're more about sending messages than receiving it. And so I think, again, it's still important to acknowledge the situation and acknowledge how people are feeling, acknowledge the impact it has on people, those are type of things. So in that way, you're still tracking the framework to a certain extent, but that's really it as far as the framework goes, as it relates to what you say publicly on social media and things like that. So it's a little bit different, but I think acknowledgement is the way to go, because you see the brands that are really suffering that right now are the ones who haven't acknowledged anything. And that's problematic. And so people are going to be reading intent into that. And so you think about CrossFit too. They might have had a little bit more grace if they acknowledged it and did something about it beforehand, but they were silent and then made an insensitive joke, and they have been eviscerated.
Yeah, totally. That must be a PR for handling PR the wrong way.
Exactly. I mean, it's cartoonishly bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think using that framework, it's a microcosm. Your shop is a microcosm of your community, right? Like any business that interacts with the public can safely assume that, your staff are representative, and we're so connected. You'd have to purposefully try not to know what's going on. And that is not good enough to try to avoid it. Just like in your analogy before of you coming home and just saying, well, I don't want to even acknowledge it. That you really don't have the choice to not acknowledge something like this. And maybe in other situations it would be different, but being compassionate in the way that you approach it does seem like a very powerful thing.
Absolutely. And I think we have to recognize that as leaders, as business owners, we're leaders. Maybe we just got in it for the money. Maybe we just got in it for the coffee. But along with that, now we're in a position where we're leading people. People look to us for leadership, whether we want to or not. So if you think about Charles Barkley, who said, "I'm not a role model." Well, you're playing basketball in front of millions of people. Young people look up to you to figure out how they should act and what they should do. You are a role model, whether you want to be or not. And you think about the guy from CrossFit, what he didn't recognize is that he was acting as if he was an individual. If he was hanging out with his friends and he said that as an individual, some people might have shaken their heads. Some of the people in his sphere might have laughed, but you're not an individual anymore. Once you reach a certain status, and it's not even that big anymore, you're an institution. He's an institution now, and institutions have certain kinds of responsibilities. And so you can't have all the benefits of being an institution without those responsibilities. And if you don't live up to those responsibilities, there are going to be consequences. And that's what he's experiencing, and that's what we can be experiencing too if we don't manage these conversations effectively and we don't handle the PR or marketing effectively.
And the positive end of all of this, we use the tactics that you're talking about, and we embrace these difficult conversations as a process and a part of building relationships rather than just salvaging relationships, then it seems like we will be the better for it. Our people will be the better for it. And so will our community. Like, it's not just about making yourself look good. It's about like doing good and being that thing that will serve and care for the community the way that they hope you will.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what we have to do. We just have to take that mantle as the leader and run with it. Sometimes we run away from it and there are consequences for that. But once we start to accept that position and all that entails, things start to fall in line.
Kwame, this was a good conversation. This was a really helpful framework to go over. And, after this, I don't think we should expect that, everything's going to go smoothly, but you've helped us in a time where I think we have such a need to explore ourselves, our businesses, and the world of the people that count on us in our businesses. So thank you for that. How can we learn more about what you do with American Negotiation Institute and the resources that you've got?
Yeah, so I think check out the podcast, Negatiate Anything. It's the top-ranked negotiation podcast in the world. And then also, of course, check out those free resources, the guides that I'd mentioned earlier, and the book, Finding Confidence in Conflict, and connect with me on LinkedIn. And also, if you find this content interesting, Chris and I are partnering up on a negotiation course for people who are in the coffee industry. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, yes, exactly. More coming on that. Kwame, really appreciate you and what you do. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I hope that episode really shed some light on how you can take the first step to have these difficult conversations and have these conversations actually be fruitful and a learning process and a facilitation of solutions that will take us forward as companies and as individuals, as members of society. You know, we're hoping that the result of these things is better at the end than it is right now. That's what we want. We want progress. And that happens in the midst of conversation. That happens when we apply things like that compassionate curiosity framework that Kwame has seen just really shape solutions for so many people in his experience. And a big thank you to Kwame for being on the show again, helping equip us to have these conversations. We truly do appreciate you. And you can find more information about American Negotiation Institute and download those free resources, the negotiation guides that he mentioned. That's over at AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com. I highly encourage you, go to find those negotiation guides, re-listen to this episode, and game plan. Think about how you can apply this right away to what you're doing in the cafe. Maybe you haven't addressed the issue yet. Maybe you have, but wherever you are, you can go further. We can do more, and we can strengthen our relationships as we have these conversations. As difficult as they may be, if they're handled the right way, conflict can be empowering, and it doesn't have to be something that tears down. It can certainly build up. And in this moment, that's what we really need to do. So thank you very much for joining me. If you want to reach out to me for anything, my email is chris@keystotheshop.com. I'd love to hear from listeners to the show, always. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.